Ethan stood in the doorway, rubbing his temples, still trying to process the last few weeks. His life, once a predictable rhythm of solitude and routine, had taken a sharp detour into the unknown ever since she arrived. Lyra. The name alone evoked something ethereal, as if she had been plucked from the night sky and dropped into his living room. 3 weeks. That was all it had been. 3 weeks since her ship, if you could even call it a ship, descended from the heavens with the quiet elegance of a falling feather. He hadn't been able to stop staring then, and he couldn't stop now. Lyra wasn't human, but in some ways she felt more human than anyone he had ever met. Her appearance was the first thing that had struck him. Luminous, almost like moonlight, had seeped into her very skin. At first glance she might have seemed delicate, too fragile for this chaotic world, but there was a silent strength in her posture, in the way she moved, like every step was deliberate, each gesture an unspoken promise of something beyond comprehension. But the real showstopper was her eyes. They shifted color with every passing emotion, a kaleidoscope of shades he could never predict. Sometimes they were a deep, oceanic blue when she was pensive, other times a warm gold when something amused her, and on rare occasions, a startling violet, like the twilight sky before a storm, when she seemed to be lost in thought. Ethan wasn't sure if he'd ever get used to that. He remembered the day she first arrived at his doorstep, no fanfare, no grand announcement, just a polite knock on the door. He'd opened it, expecting the usual mail, maybe a neighbor or a stray delivery person, and instead found Lyra standing there, gazing at him with those unreadable eyes. She had said his name, soft and steady, as if she had always known him. As if the universe had placed them together for a reason. "Hello, Ethan." That was all she said before stepping into his life. There had been no dramatic explanation of her mission, no warning about why she had come, only the quiet understanding that she was here, and for the time being, she wasn't going anywhere. In the beginning, that unsettled him. He was used to living alone, after all. There was a comfort in the solitude, in knowing that no one was around to witness his moments of vulnerability. But Lyra, she had an uncanny ability to break down the walls he had built, simply by existing. Even now, as she stood in the kitchen, effortlessly preparing a meal, despite her unfamiliarity with human food, he marveled at how quickly she adapted. It wasn't just her grace that made her presence so unsettling, it was her open curiosity about everything around her. Nothing escaped her attention: the flickering of streetlights outside the window, the subtle hum of the refrigerator, the texture of the hardwood beneath her feet. To her, every part of Earth was a puzzle, and she had made it her mission to understand each piece. "How do humans tolerate the cold?" she asked one evening, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her gaze flicking to the window where the autumn wind howled outside. Ethan chuckled, still unsure how to handle the constant barrage of questions she threw at him. "We wear more layers," he said, gesturing to his own sweater. "That's the trick." Her eyes had flashed a soft silver then, the color of curiosity. Layers. Fascinating, she seemed to file the information away, like everything else she learned. But Lyra wasn't just interested in the practicalities of Earth. No, her questions went far deeper, and that was where Ethan often found himself at a loss. The more she probed, the more he realized how little he knew about his own species. "What is love?" she had asked one night, her head tilted in that way that meant she was serious. Ethan had nearly choked on his coffee. "Love? That's a complicated question." She blinked, her eyes shifting from pale green to the lightest shade of blue, perplexed. "In my culture, love is not something we speak of. We sense it, in a way. But it is not a concept we dissect or question. It simply is." He had fumbled with his words then, trying to explain human emotions as best he could. But how did you explain something as vast and messy as love to someone who had never experienced it in the same way? How did you put into words the tangled web of feelings that could lift you to the highest peaks one moment and drag you through the darkest valleys the next? It wasn't something you could define, it was something you had to feel. That was the challenge with Lyra. Every conversation with her seemed to force him to question his own understanding of the world. She saw things so clearly, so unburdened by the complexities of human culture, and in her clarity, Ethan often felt exposed. As if she could see past the layers he wore, both the literal and the metaphorical ones, straight into the core of who he was. Yet, despite the strangeness of it all, he found himself drawn to her. There was a quiet comfort in her presence, a calm that soothed him, even when her questions rattled his carefully constructed worldview. They had fallen into an odd rhythm over the last few weeks, a sort of tentative partnership built on mutual curiosity. She would ask, and he would answer. She would explore, and he would guide. But it wasn't all questions and philosophy. Sometimes it was the little moments that stood out, the way she tilted her head when she was puzzled, the small smile that would flicker across her lips when something amused her. And though her features were alien, though her movements were more fluid than any human he had ever seen, she was still human enough to make him forget, for brief moments, that she wasn't from this world. He glanced over at her now, standing by the stove, inspecting the simmering pot with an intensity that made him smile. She was wearing one of his old flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled up clumsily, as if she hadn't quite gotten the hang of human clothing yet. It looked comically oversized on her, but she didn't seem to mind. Lyra approached everything with the same focused determination, whether it was learning how to chop vegetables or asking about the nature of human relationships. "Is the water too hot?" she asked, glancing at him with those shifting eyes, now a soft amber curiosity, but also a touch of warmth. Ethan shook his head, stepping over to check the pot. "No, you're doing fine. Just let it simmer a little longer." Lyra nodded, her attention returning to the stove, but there was something about the moment that made Ethan pause. He watched her, noting the way her brow furrowed ever so slightly, her lips pursed in concentration. It was in these small, quiet moments that he realized how much he enjoyed having her around. But there was also a growing tension in him. He hadn't fully wrapped his head around the strangeness of their situation. There was something about Lyra's presence that unsettled him, a feeling that he was being drawn into a world far beyond his understanding, and once he crossed that threshold, there would be no turning back. It wasn't just her alien nature, though that was certainly part of it. It was the way she seemed to see right through him, past his defenses, straight into the vulnerable spaces he tried so hard to keep hidden. He had always been good at keeping people at arm's length, but with Lyra, that distance didn't seem to exist. She made him question everything, including himself. He was still lost in thought when Lyra spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "You seem distracted, Ethan. Is something troubling you?" Her question pulled him back to the present, and he blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the directness of her gaze. Those eyes, now a muted violet, were studying him, not in a way that felt intrusive, but with a quiet understanding that made it impossible to hide. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure what else to say. How could he explain the unease that had been growing in him since the day she arrived? How could he put into words the feeling of being drawn into something far beyond his control? Lyra's expression remained calm, though her eyes flickered with something that almost looked like concern. "If you ever wish to speak, I am here to listen. I find that humans often carry more within themselves than they are willing to share." Ethan managed a small smile, though he couldn't shake the feeling that she saw through him far too easily. "Thanks," he murmured, turning his attention back to the stove. "I'll keep that in mind." But as the evening wore on, as they shared a quiet meal together and Lyra continued to pepper him with questions about Earth, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if, perhaps, she was right. Maybe it wasn't just the strangeness of her presence that unsettled him. Maybe it was the way she made him feel like he was teetering on the edge of something unknown, something that had the potential to change everything. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan wasn't sure if he was ready for that. It was a Friday evening, the kind that signaled the end of a long week and usually invited Ethan to retreat into the comfort of his usual routine, a quiet dinner, a book, and maybe a drink. But nothing about his life had been usual since Lyra had entered it. She was like a living, breathing disruption, gently but persistently nudging him out of his familiar patterns and into a strange new rhythm, a rhythm that was exhilarating, if he was honest with himself, but also unsettling in ways he couldn't quite put into words. Tonight, though, after a full day of showing Lyra more of Earth's wonders, he was simply tired. He had spent the afternoon answering an onslaught of her questions about architecture, history, human relationships. Her curiosity seemed endless, and he found himself both fascinated and exhausted by it. As he rubbed his eyes, he heard a faint sound coming from the living room, soft, rhythmic, with a faint hum of voices. The TV. He didn't remember turning it on. A frown crossed his face as he padded barefoot from the kitchen to the living room, a casual glance toward the couch as he walked in. He spotted Lyra, reclined in her usual position, her luminous form sprawled out with an elegant ease that still startled him at times. Her glowing skin caught the dim light of the room, giving her an otherworldly presence, even when she was doing something as mundane as watching television. But then he noticed the screen and his heart seemed to stutter in his chest. No. Ethan blinked hard, as if trying to convince himself that he was mistaken. But no, there it was, clear as day. That film. He immediately recognized the scene far too explicit for a casual evening. The kind of film that he hadn't even realized was still on his streaming services playlist. A provocative, boundary-pushing movie that wasn't exactly something one watched with company, and definitely not with a curious alien house guest. His stomach dropped, a flush of embarrassment rushing to his face so fast he could feel the heat prickling under his skin. How did she even find this? And oh God, did she understand what she was watching? Ethan cleared his throat loudly, hoping that might somehow snap the situation back to normalcy. But Lyra didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward him, her eyes shimmering in shades of soft amber, a color he had come to associate with curiosity. Calm, observant, completely unfazed. "Would you like to join me?" she asked, her voice smooth, untroubled, as though she had simply invited him to watch the news or some light-hearted comedy. Ethan froze, his brain stuttering to catch up with the reality of what was happening. His mouth opened, but no words came out at first, just a strangled sort of sound as he grappled with how exactly to respond to this. Lyra's gaze remained steady on him, her head slightly tilted in that inquisitive way of hers. There was no trace of embarrassment on her face, no awkwardness, nothing. In fact, she seemed genuinely interested in whether or not he'd sit down with her, like this was any other normal evening. Lyra, he struggled for words, trying to figure out where to even begin. You know this is kind of different, right? I mean, for humans. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, and he felt his face flush again, the discomfort evident in every syllable. Ethan could feel a strange, almost dizzying sense of vulnerability washing over him. This was not the kind of situation he ever thought he'd be in. Lyra blinked, her expression remaining neutral but thoughtful, her eyes shifting to a pale blue, the color she often took on when she was processing something new. Different how she asked, her tone patient, as if she genuinely didn't understand. Is this not a common form of human entertainment? Her question was so sincere, so devoid of judgment, that Ethan almost laughed, though it was more out of nervousness than anything else. He ran a hand through his hair, unsure how to explain it to her in a way that would make sense. Well, yes, no, kind of, he stammered, trying to string a coherent sentence together. Yeah, people watch this kind of thing, but it's not exactly something you watch with other people usually. It's private, personal. He watched her closely, hoping his explanation would clear things up, that she would immediately understand the boundaries she had accidentally crossed. But instead of recoiling or apologizing, Lyra simply nodded, her gaze flickering between him and the screen. I see, she murmured thoughtfully, leaning forward just a little. So it's not the content itself that is an issue, but the context in which it is consumed. You have cultural boundaries around certain types of intimacy. Ethan nodded slowly, though her articulation of the situation made him feel even more exposed. There was no shame in her voice, no hint of judgment, just a clinical, almost academic fascination. She truly wasn't seeing this the same way he did. Lyra's attention returned to the screen for a moment, her expression serene, her luminous skin glowing softly in the dim light of the room. I've seen many of your human films about war, violence, conquest, she said, her voice thoughtful. In those stories, pain is explored in great detail, but this, she gestured gently at the screen, the scene still playing out in the background. This is different. It seems to focus on pleasure, on connection. I was curious because it reveals a side of your species I have not yet fully understood. Her words struck him in an unexpected way. Ethan had never thought about it like that before, never framed something as raw as a provocative film in terms of intimacy and connection. To him, it was something more superficial. But Lyra's view was different. She didn't see the film through the lens of taboo or moral boundaries. She saw it as just another piece of the human experience, another puzzle to be examined. He cleared his throat again, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Yeah, I guess that's one way of looking at it. But like I said, it's not really something people sit down and watch together. At least not usually. Lyra's eyes flickered, this time a soft shade of purple, a color he hadn't seen very often. There was something deeper behind her gaze now, something more reflective. I understand, she said softly. cultural differences. It's fascinating how certain aspects of human behavior are private, while others are shared openly, even when they are more destructive. She paused, looking at him with a calm, inquisitive gaze, and Ethan felt a familiar discomfort begin to rise again. It was that feeling of being laid bare, of Lyra's unwavering attention stripping away all his defenses. But she continued, her voice gentle, "You seem conflicted. Perhaps you're feeling something beyond just cultural discomfort." Ethan blinked, startled by her perceptiveness. He shifted on his feet, suddenly hyper-aware of the tension that had built between them. Was she right? Was there something more to his reaction than just the awkwardness of the situation? She watched him carefully, her eyes shimmering softly, and Ethan felt an odd sense of vulnerability creeping in. She was studying him, not in a judgmental way, but in that quiet, probing way that made him feel like she saw more than he was willing to reveal. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I don't know," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe. It's just not something I've ever had to think about. And you," he paused, searching for the right words. "You don't see the same lines we do. The same boundaries." Lyra tilted her head, her eyes flashing with a subtle amusement. "No, I suppose I don't. But that's why I'm here, Ethan. To understand. To learn. Isn't that why you welcomed me into your home? To see the world through each other's eyes." There it was again, that quiet, disarming truth that she always seemed to have at her fingertips. Ethan's defenses, already crumbling, felt like they were dissolving under her gaze. She was right. He had invited her into his life for that very reason, to bridge the gap between two worlds, to challenge the way he saw things. And yet, in moments like these, he wasn't sure if he was ready to cross that bridge. He glanced at the TV again, the film still playing, though he hadn't been paying attention to it for the last several minutes. His focus was entirely on Lyra now, on the way her eyes shimmered with curiosity, on the strange sense of calm she exuded despite the awkwardness of the situation. "I guess I could sit." For a while he found himself saying before he could stop the words. Lyra's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. She shifted slightly, making space for him on the couch, her movements fluid and graceful, like she was part of the air around her. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his mind still buzzing with conflicting thoughts, but something inside him urged him to take the step. He walked over slowly, cautiously, and sat down beside her. The couch felt strangely unfamiliar now, as if he had never sat there before. The silence between them was thick but not uncomfortable. It was charged with something unspoken, something he couldn't quite define, and as he settled in next to her, Ethan realized that the movie on the screen was no longer the most important thing in the room. Lyra's gaze flickered to him briefly, her eyes catching the soft glow of the television light. There was no awkwardness in her posture, no sense of impropriety. For her, this was just another experience, another moment to understand humanity. And as they sat there, side by side in the quiet of the living room, Ethan found himself wondering if maybe that was the key to all of this. Maybe it wasn't about the movie, or the boundaries, or the discomfort. Maybe it was about something deeper, a connection that transcended the strangeness of their situation. He glanced at Lyra again, her serene face illuminated by the soft light of the screen, and he realized something unexpected. He liked her. Not just as a fascinating alien presence in his life, but as someone he genuinely enjoyed being around. Someone who made him think, made him question, made him feel in ways he hadn't felt in a long time. The movie continued to play, but Ethan's attention was elsewhere. He was focused on the strange, quiet bond forming between them, one that felt like it had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Lyra shifted slightly beside him, her arm brushing his ever so gently, and Ethan's breath hitched for a moment. The contact was brief, but it left an imprint, a subtle reminder that there were no clear lines in their relationship. Everything was new. Everything was unexplored. And as the night wore on, the tension slowly dissolved into something else, something fragile, unspoken, but undeniably real. As the night deepened, the quiet energy between Ethan and Lyra grew palpable. Sitting close together on the couch, their conversations softened, giving way to a more profound un-SP. Ethan, still unsure but drawn to her presence, felt a growing warmth between them. Lyra, in her graceful, serene way, mirrored his curiosity, her luminous skin glowing softly in the dim light. Their shared glances became longer, more intimate, as if each was waiting for the O. Eventually, that unspoken tension reached its peak, and with a hesitant but mutual understanding, they closed the space between them. What followed was not rushed or awkward, but rather a tender, slow exploration of boundaries both physical and emotional. Their connection, built on weeks of curiosity and trust, naturally evolved into something deeper that night. In the quiet of the room, their shared vulnerability and the crossing of those final barriers brought them closer than either had expected. It wasn't just the culmination of attraction, but the blending of two worlds, human and alien, into a single moment of intimate understanding. The night unfolded with a kind of peaceful inevitability, leaving both of them changed by the experience, yet still tethered to the strange bond they had been building since the beginning. Ethan awoke the next morning with a strange sense of calm, the faint glow of early sunlight filtering through the window blinds. The previous night lingered in his thoughts, like a melody he couldn't quite shake. Lyra had already risen. Her absence was noted by the quiet stillness in the house, but it wasn't unsettling, just different. He lay there for a moment, the events of the evening replaying in his mind, feeling the weight of something new, something unexpected. He wasn't entirely sure what had shifted between them, but he knew things would never be the same. They had crossed a threshold, though not in the way he had feared. There had been no grand, dramatic moment, no overwhelming display of emotion or passion. Instead, there was a quiet intimacy, something tender, fragile even, but powerful in its own way. The connection they had forged over the last few weeks had deepened, and for the first time since she had entered his life, Ethan felt an unshakable certainty that their bond was more than curiosity or friendship. Sitting up, he ran a hand through his hair and glanced toward the door. The faint smell of breakfast wafted through the air, something warm, earthy. He smiled, guessing Lyra had found her way to the kitchen again. Her fascination with human food had grown exponentially, though she approached it with the same meticulous curiosity she applied to everything else. She hadn't quite mastered cooking, but she was learning quickly, which was unsurprising given her seemingly limitless intellect. As Ethan padded down the hall toward the kitchen, the soft clinking of dishes reached his ears. He paused in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching her for a moment before speaking. Lyra stood by the counter, dressed in one of his spare shirts again, her movements fluid and graceful as she prepared breakfast. She was completely absorbed in the task, her luminous skin catching the morning light and making her seem almost ethereal, a being carved from the essence of starlight. "Morning," Ethan said, his voice softer than he intended, as if he were afraid of disturbing the tranquility of the scene before him. Lyra turned toward him, her eyes shimmering with a pale gold hue serenity. "Good morning, Ethan," she replied, her voice as calm and soothing as always. He walked over to the table, which had been set with surprising precision: 2 plates, toast, scrambled eggs, and coffee. It was a simple meal, but the effort behind it wasn't lost on him. Lyra had been taking to human customs with an eagerness that was hard to ignore. It was as if she wanted to understand every part of human life, every nuance, every unspoken rule, and in turn, Ethan found himself wanting to understand her more deeply as well. "I see you've been busy," he said, offering her a smile as he sat down. Lyra joined him at the table, her movements deliberate and composed. "I wanted to prepare something for you," she explained, her gaze meeting his briefly before shifting to the plate in front of her. "Food is a significant part of human culture, isn't it? A way to bond, to communicate without words." Ethan nodded, taking a sip of the coffee she had brewed. "Yeah, it is. Meals are more than just sustenance. They're a way to connect, to share time with someone." He paused, searching for the right words. Sometimes the act of sitting down and eating with someone can say more than any conversation could. Lyra studied him for a moment, her eyes flickering with that soft, shifting blue he had come to recognize as contemplation. "I have noticed," she said quietly, "that humans often attach meaning to actions that, in my culture, would seem purely functional. It is fascinating." Ethan chuckled softly. "Yeah, we tend to do that a lot. It's part of how we experience the world, I guess. Everything has a meaning or a feeling attached to it." "And last night," Lyra continued, her tone still gentle but more focused now, "did that have meaning for you?" The question was direct but not intrusive. She asked it the way she asked everything, with curiosity and without judgment, but it caught Ethan off guard, all the same. He hesitated, setting his coffee cup down, unsure how to articulate what he was feeling. He wasn't even sure he fully understood it himself. "It did," he admitted after a moment, glancing at her. but I'm still trying to figure out what exactly that meaning is." Lyra nodded, her gaze steady, patient. "I, too, am trying to understand." Ethan took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. He hadn't expected the conversation to go in this direction so quickly, but he supposed it was inevitable. Lyra wasn't one to let things linger unexamined, and after the intimacy of the previous evening it made sense that she would want to understand where they stood. "I've never met anyone like you before," he said, his voice soft. "Not just because you're from another world, but because of how you see things. You don't have the same boundaries, the same walls that humans do." Lyra tilted her head slightly, her expression curious. "Boundaries." "Yeah," Ethan continued, his brow furrowing as he tried to explain. "Humans, most of us, anyway, we have these unspoken rules about how we interact with each other. Physical space, emotional space. It's like a safety net, I guess. We put up walls to protect ourselves, to keep things from getting too messy." Lyra's eyes shimmered with pale violet now, a color Ethan had come to associate with deep thought. "And you believe these walls are necessary?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I guess I always thought they were. But ever since you came into my life, I've been questioning that." Lyra remained quiet for a moment, her gaze unwavering. Then she spoke, her voice soft but certain. "In my culture, we do not have the same concept of boundaries as humans. We value openness, transparency. Emotional and intellectual connection is sacred to us, and we do not hide our feelings from one another. It is how we grow, how we understand the world." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "That sounds nice, actually, but it's also terrifying. Letting people see all of you, I mean." Lyra smiled, a small, gentle curve of her lips that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. "I understand why it may seem frightening, but I have found that true connection only happens when we are willing to be vulnerable." Ethan stared down at his plate for a moment, her words settling over him like a weight and a comfort all at once. Vulnerability. That was the key, wasn't it? The thing he had been avoiding for so long, not just with Lyra but with everyone. He had always kept people at arm's length, too afraid to let them see the parts of him that were messy, complicated, flawed. And yet, here she was, someone from an entirely different world, someone who didn't even understand the concept of those walls, and she was asking him to be open, to be honest. He looked up at her, meeting her gaze. "It's not easy for me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Being vulnerable, I mean, letting people in." Lyra's eyes softened to a warm gold, her smile gentle. "You are not alone in that struggle, Ethan. Even among my people, vulnerability requires courage, but I believe that is where true strength lies." He let her words sink in, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. She wasn't pushing him, wasn't demanding anything. She was simply offering him the space to be himself, without judgment, without expectation. It was a kind of freedom he hadn't realized he needed. "I think," he began, his voice faltering for a moment before he found his footing again. "I think I want to try. To be more open. With you." Lyra's smile widened just a fraction, her eyes glowing softly with warmth. "I would like that, too." They sat in silence for a while, the quiet between them no longer heavy with tension but filled with the comfort of mutual understanding. Ethan could feel the shift in their relationship, the boundaries between them dissolving, not in a way that felt rushed or overwhelming, but in a way that felt right. It was like the two of them were slowly unraveling the complexities of their connection, piece by piece, with patience and care. And for the first time since Lyra had arrived, Ethan didn't feel afraid of where this path might lead. He didn't know what the future held for them. How could he, when there were two beings from entirely different worlds? But he knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. And that thought brought him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. As the morning stretched on, their conversation drifted to lighter topics: Lyra's continued fascination with human cuisine, Ethan's attempts to explain the intricacies of human humor, something she still struggled to understand, and the various oddities of Earth life that never ceased to intrigue her. There were moments of laughter, moments of shared quiet, and moments where their gazes met in a way that felt loaded with meaning. By the time breakfast was finished, the sun had fully risen, casting a warm glow over the kitchen. Ethan stood, gathering the dishes, and Lyra joined him, helping to clear the table with her usual quiet efficiency. As they worked together, Ethan couldn't help but feel that this This simple act of sharing a meal, of moving through the day side by side, was just as significant as any of the deeper conversations they had shared. It was in these little moments, these quiet acts of togetherness, that their bond was truly solidified. And as Ethan glanced at Lyra, who was meticulously stacking the dishes with a thoughtful expression, he realized something profound. He wasn't just intrigued by her anymore. He was growing to care for her, in a way that went far beyond curiosity. And that, more than anything, terrified him. The soft hum of the city filled the air as Ethan and Lyra walked down the sidewalk, side by side but not touching. It was a cool evening, the kind where the breeze held a chill just sharp enough to bite through a light jacket, but not quite cold enough to make you wish for a heavy coat. Ethan stuffed his hands in his pockets, glancing at Lyra from the corner of his eye. Her gaze was fixed ahead, the shifting lights of the city reflected in her eyes, now a calm, tranquil blue. She moved with that same fluid grace, her every step deliberate, as though she was both a part of the world and separate from it. There had been a shift between them since the morning. Something had changed, but neither of them had spoken about it directly. Instead, they had fallen into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't feel heavy or awkward, but simply existed. Ethan could feel it, though the undercurrent of emotions that hadn't yet been addressed, the subtle tension that neither of them seemed ready to confront head-on. He wasn't entirely sure where they were walking, only that the streets were familiar, lit by the occasional flicker of street lamps and the distant glow of passing cars. The air smelled of rain, though the sky was clear, and Ethan found himself wondering, not for the first time, how different this city must seem through Lyra's eyes. "Does it still feel strange?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Lyra turned her head slightly toward him, her eyes shimmering a soft shade of violet, the color she often wore when she was thinking deeply. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone gentle, curious. "Being here," he clarified, "on Earth, in a place so different from wherever you came from, does it still feel strange to you, or are you getting used to it?" Lyra was silent for a moment, considering his question with the same thoughtful intensity she applied to everything. Then, she nodded slowly, her eyes shifting to a pale blue, tinged with hints of green. "It still feels strange," she admitted softly. "But I am beginning to understand it more. Your world is complex, filled with layers of meaning, layers that are sometimes difficult to unravel." Ethan chuckled lightly, his breath misting in the cool air. "Yeah, that's one way of putting it." They continued walking, the city's lights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Lyra's gaze wandered over the buildings, the cars, the people bustling past them, ordinary scenes, but to her, each one seemed to carry a significance that he couldn't quite grasp. She wasn't just observing, she was absorbing, understanding, piecing together the puzzle of humanity one fragment at a time. "I've noticed," she said after a pause, "that humans often carry things with them, things that are unseen but felt." Ethan glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Lyra's eyes shifted to a soft gold, her lips curving into a small, thoughtful smile. "Emotions, memories, they shape how you see the world, even when you are not consciously aware of them. I see it in the way people move, in the way they interact with one another. It's as though you are all carrying invisible burdens." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat, her words hitting closer to home than he had expected. "Yeah," he murmured. "That's probably true. Most people carry a lot of stuff around, whether they realize it or not." Lyra nodded, her gaze returning to the city around them. "And you?" she asked quietly. "What do you carry with you, Ethan?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan felt his chest tighten, the weight of her gaze pressing into him, even though she wasn't looking directly at him. He hadn't expected her to ask something so personal, not now, not after everything that had already shifted between them. But then again, this was Lyra. She never shied away from difficult questions, never hesitated to dig deeper. Ethan took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs as he considered her question. What did he carry? It wasn't something he liked to think about, let alone talk about. But with Lyra, he had already begun to open doors he had kept closed for so long. Maybe it was time to open another one. "I guess I carry regret," he said finally, his voice low. "Fear, too. I've made a lot of mistakes, and sometimes it feels like they're always right there, just waiting to remind me of everything I've done wrong. And the fear. Well, I guess that's just part of being human. Fear of the unknown, Fear of losing people, fear of feeling too much. Lyra's gaze flickered toward him, her eyes shifting to a deep violet, a color that always seemed to signal that she was absorbing something important. Fear is not exclusive to humans, she said softly. But it seems to shape your actions in ways that are more profound than I had realized. Ethan shrugged, his hands still buried in his pockets. Yeah, I guess it does. It's not always a bad thing, though. Sometimes fear keeps you from doing stupid things, from getting hurt. Lyra nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. But it also keeps you from experiencing things fully, does it not? Ethan didn't respond right away. Her question hit too close to the truth, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face that. But as they continued walking, he found himself unable to ignore the quiet truth in her words. How many times had he held himself back, kept people at arm's length, avoided risks, avoided emotions because of fear? How much of his life had been shaped by the walls he had built around himself? You're right, he said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. I guess it does. They walked in silence for a while, the sounds of the city fading into the background. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, questions and feelings he couldn't quite sort out. There was something about Lyra, something about the way she saw him, the way she asked the questions no one else ever did that made him feel exposed, vulnerable. But at the same time there was a strange comfort in it, like being seen for the first time. After what felt like an eternity, Lyra spoke again, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Last night she began, when we shared that moment, I felt something I have not experienced before. A connection, but deeper, it was. Unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, her words bringing him back to the memory of the previous evening, the quiet, intimate moment that had passed between them. It had been unexpected, and even now, he wasn't sure what to make of it. But hearing her acknowledge it, hearing her describe it as something new and meaningful, made the feelings he had been trying to push aside rise to the surface again. Yeah, he said quietly. I felt it too. Lyra stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Her eyes were a soft gold now, warm and steady, her expression open and unguarded. I want to understand this connection, Ethan. But I also want to respect your boundaries. I sense that you are still unsure, and I do not wish to cause you discomfort. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her gaze making his pulse quicken. She was offering him an out, a chance to pull back if he wasn't ready. But the truth was, he didn't want to pull back. Not anymore. He had spent so long building walls, so long keeping people at a distance, that he had forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. And now, with Lyra, he didn't want to keep those walls up any longer. I am unsure, he admitted, his voice steady but soft. But I don't want to be. I don't want to keep holding back. Lyra's eyes shimmered with something like understanding, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Then we will move forward. Together, she said quietly. But at your pace, Ethan. Always at your pace. Ethan felt a rush of relief at her words, followed by a warmth that spread through his chest. She wasn't pushing him, wasn't demanding anything. She was simply offering him the space to explore this new connection, to figure out what it meant for both of them. It was more than he had ever expected, and exactly what he needed. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They stood there for a moment, the city buzzing around them, but it felt like they were in their own little world. Ethan could feel the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between them, but for the first time it didn't feel heavy. It felt hopeful. Lyra took a small step closer to him, her presence warm, calming. I believe, she said softly, that we are both learning from each other. Your world is new to me, but so is this connection. I do not fully understand it, but I am willing to explore it if you are. Ethan smiled, a genuine smile that he hadn't felt in a long time. I am, he said. I'm ready. And in that moment, standing there in the middle of a bustling city, with the cold wind swirling around them and the lights flickering above, Ethan realized that he had taken the first step towards something he had been avoiding for far too long. He didn't know what the future held for him and Lyra, didn't know how their worlds would continue to collide, but he knew one thing for certain: he wanted to find out. Together. The next morning arrived with the kind of quiet stillness that only happens at the cusp of something unknown. Ethan woke slowly, the world outside still dim with the early light of dawn, a soft haze of silver mist hanging low over the city. He could hear the faint hum of cars in the distance, but it seemed far away, like the sound couldn't quite reach him. His apartment, usually a place of solitude, felt different today. Not empty, but full charged with the weight of all that had changed. Ethan sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair as he glanced toward the living room. He half expected to see Lyra there, her luminous form bathed in the soft morning light, studying some new aspect of human culture with that quiet intensity of hers. But the room was empty, and for a brief moment he felt a pang of worry. Was she gone? Then, from the kitchen, he heard the faint clinking of dishes and the unmistakable sound of running water. Relief flooded him, and he exhaled, smiling slightly. Lyra was still here. And with that realization came the memory of the night before the walk, the conversation, the understanding they had reached. He wasn't used to this openness, this sense of moving forward with someone, without walls. But it felt right. For the first time in a long time, it felt like he wasn't hiding from himself or from anyone else. Throwing off the covers, Ethan swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, stretching as he padded barefoot toward the kitchen. The air was cool against his skin, a reminder that autumn had fully settled in, but the chill didn't bother him. There was a warmth in the apartment now that had nothing to do with the temperature. As he approached the kitchen, he found Lyra standing by the window, looking out at the quiet street below. She was holding a mug in her hands, one of his mugs, the handle too large for her slender fingers, and her eyes were a soft, contemplative shade of blue. She hadn't noticed him yet, and for a moment Ethan just watched her, struck once again by how otherworldly and yet how familiar she had become. In the early morning light, her luminous skin seemed to glow faintly, catching the pale rays of sunlight that filtered through the window. She looked peaceful, her gaze distant, as if she were lost in thought. "Morning," Ethan said softly, not wanting to startle her. Lyra turned, her eyes shifting to a gentle gold as she met his gaze. A small smile curved her lips, and she nodded in greeting. "Good morning, Ethan." He stepped closer, leaning against the counter as he watched her for a moment. The tension that had lingered between them for weeks seemed to have dissolved overnight, replaced by something softer, more open. There was still so much he didn't understand about her world, her people, and even her emotions, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to explore those unknowns. And as they stood there in the quiet of the morning, Ethan realized that the fear he had carried for so long, the fear of vulnerability, of connection, had lessened. "How long have you been up?" he asked, his voice low as he reached for the coffee pot. "A while," Lyra replied, her tone thoughtful. She turned her gaze back to the window, her eyes shifting to a shade of blue-green that Ethan had come to associate with curiosity and reflection. "Your world is very different in the early hours. Quieter. It gives me time to think." Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her. "What are you thinking about?" Lyra hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "Last night," she said softly. "The conversation we had, the connection we spoke of. It is still new to me, but I have been trying to understand it." Ethan nodded, feeling a familiar stir of uncertainty in his chest. He had spent so long avoiding this kind of conversation, but with Lyra, it felt inevitable. She saw everything so clearly, with such precision, and he knew that avoiding the truth wasn't an option with her. Not anymore. "I've been thinking about it too," he admitted, setting his mug down on the counter. "I'm not used to any of this, letting someone in like this." Lyra turned to face him fully, her eyes softening to a warm gold. "Nor am I," she said gently. "In my culture we value connection deeply, but it is often a more intellectual bond. What I feel with you is different. It is emotional. I have never experienced it in this way before." Ethan's heart skipped a beat at her words, the weight of what she was saying sinking in. He had always assumed that her people were above human emotions, that their connections were based on something far more advanced than the messy, complicated feelings humans dealt with. But hearing her admit that this was new for her too, that she was experiencing this bond with him for the first time, made him realize how much they had both been navigating uncharted territory. "I didn't expect any of this to happen," Ethan said quietly. "When you first showed up, I didn't think we'd end up here. But now, I'm starting to realize that maybe this is exactly what I needed. To stop hiding, to stop pushing people away." Lyra's gaze softened further, her eyes glowing a soft, shimmering gold. She stepped closer to him, her movements graceful, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure how much space he needed. But Ethan didn't move away. Instead, he felt himself drawn toward her, toward the warmth of her presence. Ethan, she said softly, her voice like a gentle melody. I do not wish to cause you pain or discomfort. If this connection is too much, if it is overwhelming for you, please tell me. I will not push you beyond what you are ready for. Ethan shook his head, his heart racing as he looked into her eyes. It's not too much, he said, his voice steady despite the rush of emotion swirling inside him. It's just new. But I want this, Lyra. I want to figure this out with you. Whatever this is, whatever we're becoming, I'm ready for it. Lyra's eyes glimmered with something like relief, and she smiled a real, genuine smile that made her luminous features even more striking. For a moment they stood there in the quiet of the kitchen, the weight of their shared understanding hanging in the air between them. There was no need for grand declarations or sweeping gestures. What they had was something deeper, something unspoken but profoundly real. As the silence stretched on, Ethan felt a gentle pull in his chest, a warmth that spread through him like sunlight breaking through a clouded sky. He reached out, his hand brushing against Lyra's, and for a brief moment he hesitated. But then he closed the distance, taking her hand in his. Lyra's skin was warm, soft, and as their fingers intertwined, Ethan felt the last of his defenses crumble. He had spent so long building walls, so long keeping people at a distance, but now, with Lyra standing in front of him, he realized that those walls were no longer necessary. She didn't see his flaws as weaknesses. She didn't see his vulnerabilities as something to be avoided. Instead, she embraced them, just as he was beginning to embrace hers. I want to understand this, Lyra said softly, her gaze never leaving his. I want to understand us. But I need you to guide me, Ethan. I need you to help me navigate these emotions, these feelings. They are new to me, but I trust you. Ethan's heart swelled at her words, and he squeezed her hand gently. We'll figure it out together, he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. One step at a time. Lyra's smile widened, and for the first time since she had entered his life, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from certainty or control. It was the peace of acceptance, the knowledge that he didn't have to have all the answers, that he didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be present, open, and willing to explore whatever this connection was. They spent the rest of the morning together in quiet conversation, the easy rhythm of their companionship settling back into place. But now, there was something different, something deeper between them. The boundaries that had once defined their relationship had softened, and in their place was a bond that felt both fragile and unbreakable at the same time. As the day wore on, they ventured out into the city again, wandering through the familiar streets with a new sense of purpose. They talked about everything and nothing about Lyra's observations of Earth, about Ethan's memories of his childhood, about the little moments that made life feel meaningful, and all the while that quiet, unspoken understanding lingered between them. By the time the sun began to set, casting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they found themselves sitting on a bench overlooking the water. The city was alive with the hum of evening activity, but for Ethan, it felt like the world had quieted, leaving just the two of them in this moment of peace. I've been thinking, Lyra said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon, about what comes next. Ethan glanced at her, his heart skipping a beat. What do you mean? Lyra turned to him, her eyes a soft shade of violet, reflective, contemplative. I came to this world to observe, to learn, but now, I feel that my purpose has changed. Being here with you, it has given me a new understanding of what it means to connect, to belong. And I wonder if perhaps this is where I am meant to stay. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, her words sinking in. The idea of Lyra leaving had always lingered in the back of his mind, a shadow he hadn't wanted to confront. But now, hearing her speak of staying, of choosing to stay with him, filled him with a mixture of hope and fear. Are you sure? He asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra nodded, her gaze steady. Yes, I am sure. Ethan smiled, a quiet, relieved smile that carried the weight of all the emotions he had been holding back. Then stay, he said softly. Stay with me, Lyra. And in that moment, with the city buzzing around them, and the sky painted in fading light, Ethan realized that they had both crossed a threshold, one that couldn't be undone, but one that neither of them wanted to. They had found something together, something rare and precious, and for the first time Ethan wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. He was ready to face it, with Lyra by his side.